The ink on the contract was still wet when Alpha Bane turned his back on the woman he once called his mate. There was no goodbye, only the cold, transactional sound of a chest of gold being slid across a wooden table. He didn't see a partner. He saw a commodity, a brilliant mind he was happy to sell to the highest bidder. To Bane, Mira was nothing more than a human bandage, a sacrifice to be thrown into the silent, stagnant tomb of a fallen legend. As the heavy oak doors of the gray crown court groaned open, the air didn't smell of death as the rumors promised. Instead, it was thick with a terrifying, charged stillness. In the center of the dim room sat King Vane, a man who had been a frozen statue of agony for 20 years. His eyes were wide, fixed on a horizon no one else could see. His body a masterpiece of paralyzed muscle and trapped power. The world had written him off as a living corpse, but as Mira stepped closer, she realized the horrifying truth. The king wasn't dead. He was a caged storm, screaming in a silence that had lasted 2 decades, waiting for the one person brave enough to touch a cursed god. I stood at the edge of the world, watching the only home I'd ever known vanish behind the dust of a carriage wheel. My mate, the man who promised to protect me, had traded me like a piece of livestock to a court that smelled of ancient dust and forgotten grief. They led me into a room where the air was heavy with the weight of 20 years of silence. And there he was, Alpha King Vane. He sat on that throne like a masterpiece of agony, his eyes wide and fixed on a wall he hadn't seen in 2 decades. Everyone told me he was a hollow shell. They told me I was just a human bandage sent to soak up his misery until I died of a broken heart. But when I reached out, my fingers trembling, my breath hitching in my throat, and touched the cold skin of his hand, a spark jolted through my marrow. He wasn't gone. He was screaming in the dark. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just a tool to be used. I was a lifeline. I am Mira, and this is how I awakened a king. The ink on the parchment was the loudest thing in the room. I watched the quill scratch against the heavy vellum, a jagged, rhythmic sound that felt like it was tearing through my own skin. Bane didn't even look up as he signed my life away. His hand was steady, his fingers relaxed. The same hand that had held mine during our mating ceremony. The same hand that had once traced the line of my jaw and promised me the world. Now that hand was moving with the cold, bored precision of a man signing a trade agreement for grain or timber. I stood between two guards from the gray crown court, my wrists already heavy with iron. The cold of the metal was sinking into my bones, but it was nothing compared to the absolute frost in my chest. I kept my eyes on the back of Bane's neck. I wanted him to feel the weight of my gaze. I wanted the sheer force of my betrayal to burn a hole through him. There, Bane said, setting the quill down with a soft click. He finally turned to face me, and for a second I looked for a flicker of regret, a twitch in his eye, a tightening of his mouth, anything to show that he knew he was committing a crime against my soul. But there was nothing. His eyes were as flat and gray as a winter sky. He looked at me and saw a ledger that had finally been balanced. You always were so proud of that mind of yours, Mira, always burying your nose in those dusty books, acting like you were better than the rest of the pack because you could remember every word on a page. Well, congratulations. Your obsession has finally paid off. You're actually worth something to me now. He gestured to the heavy chest of gold sitting on the table between us. It was the price of a queen's ransom, or in this case, the price of a human bandage for a dying king. Bane had sold me to the Gray Crown Court to pay off his debts and secure his borders, and he was smiling about it. "You're selling your mate," I whispered. My voice sounded thin and brittle, like dry leaves underfoot. "You're breaking a sacred bond for gold." Bane laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that echoed off the stone walls. "A bond? Mira, a bond is for people who contribute. You were just a weight around my neck, a brilliant, useless weight. But the Alpha King needs someone with a refined mind to sit in the dark and watch him rot. It's the perfect job for you. You can read to a corpse until it finally stops breathing, and I can finally lead this pack without your constant intellectual interference." He walked toward me, leaning in close until I could smell the stale ale on his breath. The guards didn't move. They stood like statues, indifferent to the murder of my heart. "Don't look at me with those watery eyes," Bane hissed, his voice dropping to a cruel sliver. "You should be thanked. For the first time in your life, you're doing something useful. You're a sacrifice, Mira. That's all you've ever been. Just a tool I'm finally trading in for a better model." The guards stepped forward then, their iron grip tightening on my arms. I didn't struggle. What was the point? My home was gone. My mate was a monster wearing a familiar face. My mother was back in the pack, her safety used as the final knife Brutus, no, Bane, had held to my throat to make me walk into these chains. "Move," one of the guards grunted. As they dragged me toward the door, I didn't look back at the fire or the home I'd helped build. I kept my head high, even as the chains rattled against my shins, marking every step toward a tomb. I felt the bond snap, a clean, violent break that left a jagged hole in my center. Bane was already reaching for the gold, his fingers tracing the coins with more tenderness than he had ever shown me. I was being sent to a place where men went to vomit and servants went to die. I was being sent to sit in the silence of a man who hadn't moved in 20 years. But as the heavy carriage door slammed shut, plunging me into the darkness that smelled of cold iron and rain, I realized something that made my blood turn to liquid fire. Bane thought he had sold a servant. He thought he had disposed of a burden. He had no idea that by throwing me into the dark, he had given me the one thing I needed to destroy him. I wasn't just going to watch a king die. I was going to find out why the world was so afraid of the man in that room. And if there was a spark of life left in that frozen alpha, I would find it, even if I had to burn my own soul to light the way. The carriage lurched forward, and as the gates of my old life creaked shut behind me, I closed my eyes and began to remember every single thing I had ever read about the king's curse. I would not wither. I would not break. But as we hit the open road, I realized the lavender oil I'd tucked into my sleeve was gone, and the only thing I could smell was the bitter metallic scent of my own fear. The carriage wheels stopped with a final bone-jarring thud. I sat in the dark for a long time, my fingers numb and my mind a shattered mess of memories from the pack house. I kept expecting Bane to burst through the door, laughing, telling me it was all a sick joke to test my loyalty. But when the door finally opened, it wasn't a mate's hand that reached for me. It was the cold, armored glove of a royal guard. The Gray Crown Court was a sprawling skeleton of gray stone and sharp spires that seemed to stab at the bruised purple of the evening sky. It didn't look like a palace. It looked like a tomb designed by someone who hated the sun. I stumbled as they led me across the courtyard, the chains on my ankles biting into my skin with every step. My pride was the only thing keeping my knees from hitting the dirt. I wouldn't let these strangers see me break. I wouldn't let Bane win by becoming the hollow girl he claimed I was. "Stop," a voice commanded. It wasn't a roar, but it had the weight of a mountain behind it. I looked up and saw a man standing at the top of the grand stairs. This was Tyne. He looked like a younger, softer version of the legends I'd read about the king. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with a weary kind of grief that made my own chest ache. He didn't look at me like a slave or a prize. He looked at me with a desperate, terrifying kind of hope. "You're the one from Greenmore," Tyne said, stepping down toward me. He signaled the guards to step back. "The one with the mind that never forgets?" "I'm the one who was sold," I corrected him. My voice was raspy, stripped of its warmth. "Don't dress it up in fancy words, Prince. Your gold is sitting in my mate's lap right now. Just tell me where you want me to sit until I die." Tyne flinched as if I'd slapped him. He reached out as if to touch my shoulder, but pulled back at the last second. I didn't want it to be like this. But my brother, he's trapped. No one can reach him. The healers say he's a lost cause, but I can't let him go. I need someone who won't just look at him and see a monster. I need someone who can think. He turned and led me deep into the heart of the palace. The further we went, the colder it got. The walls were lined with tapestries that had faded to the color of dried blood. There was a heaviness in the air, a pressure that made it hard to breathe. We stopped in front of a set of black iron doors that looked thick enough to hold back a god. "He hasn't moved in 20 years, Tyne whispered, his hand trembling on the latch. "He doesn't eat, he doesn't sleep. He just exists. Please, whatever you see in there, don't scream." The doors groaned open. I expected a smell, the stench of rot, the sour tang of a body failing. But the room was as cold as a meat locker and smelled of nothing but ancient dust and burnt wax. And there, in the center of the room, sitting on a throne of jagged obsidian, was King Vane. My heart stopped. He wasn't a man, he was a statue carved from muscle and silver hair. He was stripped to the waist, his chest broad and scarred from 1,000 battles, but his skin had a terrifying waxen sheen to it. He was seated perfectly upright, his hands gripping the armrests so hard the stone had hairline fractures. But it was his eyes that destroyed me. They were wide open, a piercing, electric blue that seemed to be burning through the far wall. He didn't blink, he didn't breathe. He was a god of war caught in a single eternal second of pure agony. I could see the tension in his neck, the way his jaw was locked so tight I wondered if his teeth had turned to powder over the last 2 decades. He was right there, inches away, but he was light years gone. "Leave us," I said, my voice barely a breath. Tyne nodded and backed out, the heavy doors thudding shut behind him. The sound echoed forever. I was alone with a ghost. I walked a slow circle around him, my chains clinking softly on the floor. I looked at the way the muscles in his arms were corded, frozen in a permanent state of fight. He wasn't just paralyzed, he was being held by something. I reached out, my hand shaking so hard I had to tuck it into my opposite sleeve. I sat on the floor at his feet, the cold stones seeping into my dress. The silence in the room was so thick, it felt like it was filling my ears with lead. I watched his chest, waiting for a rise, a fall, a twitch of a finger. Nothing. Hour after hour passed. The candles burned down to stubs, and the moonlight crawled across the floor like a pale spider. I thought about Bane. I thought about the way he'd laughed when he sold me. I looked up at the king's frozen face and felt a sudden violent surge of kinship. We were both prisoners. We were both discarded by the people who were supposed to love us. "They think you're a corpse, Vane," I whispered into the dark. "They think you're a hole where a king used to be." I leaned forward, placing my palm flat against his bare foot. It was as cold as a glacier. But as I closed my eyes, trying to focus my mind, I felt a vibration. It was so faint I almost missed it. A low, rhythmic thrumming deep beneath the skin, like a heartbeat trapped behind a mile of solid rock. My eyes snapped open, and I looked up into those unmoving blue depths. A single clear drop of moisture was forming at the corner of his eye, hanging there, refusing to fall. He was in there. He was awake. He was watching me, and he was screaming. The sun didn't rise in this room. It just turned the darkness into a heavy, suffocating gray. I hadn't slept. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Bain's smug face, the way he'd pocketed that gold like it was a reward for a job well done. The betrayal was a physical weight in my stomach, a cold stone that refused to dissolve. But every time I opened my eyes, I was staring at something even more haunting. Vane hadn't moved. Not an inch. Not a hair. Prince Tyne had left me with a bowl of warm water, a stack of clean linens, and a look of such profound apology that it almost made me sick. He knew. He knew that sending me in here was like burying me alive alongside his brother. But he was desperate, and desperate men don't care about the collateral damage. I stood up, my joints cracking in the silence. My chains clinked, a sharp metallic reminder that I was no longer a person. I was a piece of property assigned to a monument of grief. I approached the king slowly. Up close, he was even more terrifying. His skin wasn't just pale, it looked like marble that had been polished until it was translucent. I could see the faint blue of his veins, frozen like rivers under ice. I have to clean you, I whispered. My voice felt too loud, a sacrilege in this tomb. They told me that's what I'm here for, to be your hands, since yours won't work. I dipped a cloth into the water and wrung it out. My hands were shaking. I started with his arm. Touching him felt like touching a statue left out in a blizzard. There was no give to his muscle. It was rock hard, locked in a permanent, violent contraction. As I wiped away the dust of 20 years, I felt a sob rising in my throat. This man had been a warrior, a king. Now he was just a shelf for dust. Bain had called me a human bandage. He thought he was being clever, mocking the way I always tried to fix things, the way I used my head to solve the pack's problems. He thought this would break me, that the sight of a man I couldn't fix would finally shut me up. I moved the cloth up toward Vane's neck, my breath catching as I got closer to his face. His eyes were still fixed on that same spot on the wall. Blue. So blue they looked like they were made of electrified glass. I reached out to wipe a smudge from his jawline, and that's when I saw it. It wasn't a movement, it was a vibration. Right where his jaw met his ear, there was a tiny rhythmic pulse. It wasn't the steady thud of a heart. It was a flicker, a rapid, frantic shimmering of light beneath the skin, like a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage. It was a frequency, a hum that I could feel in my own teeth. My photographic memory kicked into gear, flipping through every forbidden text I'd ever snuck out of the Graymore archives. I recognized that signature. It wasn't a disease, it was a lock. A magical cage had been hammered into his nervous system, freezing his body while leaving his mind wide open. I dropped the cloth. The wet thud echoed like a gunshot. I leaned in, my face inches from his. I stopped looking at him as a statue and started looking at him as a man. I looked into those blue eyes, and for the first time, I didn't see emptiness. I saw a riot. I saw 20 years of unuttered screams. I saw the agony of a man who had felt every itch, every cramp, every cold draft, and every insult thrown his way, without being able to blink. He was in there. He was fully, horribly awake. The horror of it hit me like a physical blow. To be trapped in your own skin, unable to even scream for death while the world moved on without you, while your own brother looked at you with pity and your enemies forgot you existed. It was a cruelty so deep that made Bain's betrayal look like a scraped knee. I felt a tear slip down my cheek and land on his frozen shoulder. I didn't wipe it away. I reached out and placed my fingers directly over that humming pulse on his jaw. The vibration intensified, a desperate, jagged rhythm that felt like it was trying to weld itself to my skin. He knew I was there. He knew I had seen the flicker. I leaned in closer until my lips were right against the shell of his ear. I wanted my words to be the only thing in his universe. I wanted to reach through the 20 years of darkness and pull him back, even if it was just for a second. Vane, I breathed, my voice thick with a sudden fierce protectiveness. I'm not like the others. I'm not here to watch you die, and I'm not here to pity you. I felt the frequency under my fingers spike, a sharp, electric jolt of recognition. I see the cage, I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs. I see what they did to you, and I promise you, on the soul of the woman who was just sold for gold, I'm going to break it. I pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. They hadn't moved, but the intensity in them had changed. There was a spark there now, a tiny flickering flame of pure, unadulterated rage. I see you, I said, my voice finally steady. In that moment, the silent king didn't move, but the air in the room suddenly turned white hot with a power that made my chains rattle against the floor. The gold didn't just buy grain or weapons, it bought a silence that made my skin crawl from 100 miles away. Back at the Greywar Pack, the air was thick with the smell of roasting meat and expensive wine, a celebration funded by the sale of my soul. I wasn't there to see it, but I could feel the ghost of the party in the marrow of my bones. Every laugh Bane let out was a needle under my fingernails. Every toast he raised was a footprint on my grave. Bane sat at the head of the long timber table, his chest puffed out like a rooster who had finally cleared the yard of its rivals. He looked at the heavy bags of coins stacked near his plate with more love than he had ever shown me during our 3 years of partnership. To him, those coins weren't just currency. They were proof of his genius. He had managed to turn a useless mate into a fortune, and the pack was eating it up. Literally. To a new era, Bane shouted, his voice booming through the hall, thick with the arrogance of a man who thought he had outsmarted fate itself. He raised a silver gullet, newly purchased, of course, and the pack roared back in a terrifying, unified hunger. Sitting beside him was Hera. She was everything I wasn't, sharp-edged, hungry for blood, and draped in silks that cost more than a year of my mother's medicine. She leaned into him, her hand trailing over his arm with a proprietary greed that made my stomach turn, even from the distance of my exile. She didn't want his heart, she wanted his power. And now that he had cleared the waste out of the way, the path to the throne was open. Tell me again, Alpha, Hera purred, her voice loud enough for the elders to hear. Did she cry? Did she beg for you to keep her? Bane let out a jagged laugh, the sound of glass breaking in a dark room. Mira, no. She stood there with that vacant, intellectual stare of hers, acting like she was above it all. Even when the iron hit her skin, she didn't say a word. She's probably in that dusty tomb right now, trying to explain the history of the stars to a man who's been a vegetable for 20 years. The table erupted in mocking laughter. I could hear it in my head, the sharp, barking sounds of people who had once called me sister, who had once come to me to help them settle their disputes or heal their children. Now I was just a joke, a cautionary tale about what happens to females who think their minds are more valuable than their obedience. It's a mercy, really, Being continued, leaning back and throwing a bone to the hounds circling the table. She was a weight, always questioning my orders, always bringing up some dusty law or forgotten treaty. I didn't just get a chest of gold, I got my freedom back. The Gray Crown Court wanted a human bandage, and I gave them a girl who was already bleeding out. It was the best trade I've ever made. He looked at Hera, his eyes dark with a heat that was purely transactional. He reached out and gripped the back of her neck, pulling her close. He wasn't looking for a mate, he was looking for an accomplice. They were two predators celebrating the fact that they had finally called the weak from the herd. I thought of the way Bane used to look at me when we were younger, before the weight of the alpha title turned his heart into a knot of coal. There was a time when he'd admired my memory, when he'd asked me to read to him because he liked the sound of my voice. But power is a hungry god. It demands sacrifices. And he had offered me up without a second thought, happy to watch me burn if it meant he could sit in the warmth of the fire. "She'll be dead within the month," one of the elders shouted, his face red with drink. "The king's room kills everyone eventually. The silence drives them mad before the rot gets them." "Then we keep the gold, and I don't have to worry about her coming back to claim her share of the pack house," Vane replied, his grin widening into something feral. "It's a win-win. We're rid of the burden, and we're the richest pack in the north. Tonight, we drink to the future, a future without dead weight." He kissed Hera then, a hard, bruising thing that had nothing to do with affection and everything to do with conquest. They were laughing into each other's mouths, surrounded by the gold that had been paid for by my life. They thought the story was over. They thought they had written the final chapter and closed the book on the girl who remembered too much. But as Bane raised his glass for the 10th time that night, bragging to anyone who would listen about how he had disposed of the trash, the waste he had discarded was currently holding the hand of a god. He didn't know that the silence he had sent me into was actually a countdown. Back in the cold, dark chamber of the Gray Crown Court, I felt a sudden freezing clarity. The bond was gone, but the anger was just beginning to bloom. I looked at the frozen king, at the rage vibrating under his skin, and I felt a smile touch my lips for the first time since the chains were locked. Bane was celebrating his wealth. He was courting his new queen. He was sleeping soundly, thinking he had won. He had no idea that I was no longer the girl who begged for a place at his table. I was the woman who was about to set his world on fire, and I was going to do it with a king he thought was a corpse. The air in the library didn't just smell like old paper, it smelled like failure. Thousands of books lined these walls, and every single one of them had failed the man sitting in the dark upstairs. I ran my fingers along the spines, my touch leaving trails in the thick gray dust. Rome, the head scholar, watched me from the corner of his eye with a look that suggested I was a stray dog that had somehow wandered into a holy temple. He was a man made of ink and arrogance, convinced that because he hadn't found a solution in 40 years of study, one didn't exist. "You're wasting your time, girl," Rome said, his voice as dry as the parchment he was hoarding. "The king's condition is a natural collapse of the spirit. It's been cataloged, debated, and mourned. Your intellect would be better spent ensuring his pillows are straight." I didn't look at him. I couldn't. If I did, I might scream. "I'm not here to straighten pillows, Rome. I'm here because I see things you've chosen to ignore because they don't fit into your neat little boxes." I pulled a heavy, leather-bound volume from the bottom shelf, the weight of it straining my wrists. My mind was already racing, connecting the flickering pulse I'd felt under Vane's jaw to an obscure theory about emotional resonance. I had spent the last 3 nights staring into the king's frozen eyes, and I had realized something that made my skin crawl. The palace was drowning in grief. Every servant who walked past his door bowed their head in a performance of misery. Every word Tyne spoke was heavy with the expectation of death. "The human bandage," I whispered to myself, flipping through pages of jagged handwritten notes. A myth, Rome snapped, stepping closer. A theoretical parasite. The idea that a powerful alpha can subconsciously feed on the collective sorrow of his people to keep himself in a state of stasis. It's nonsense. Is it? I turned to face him, the anger I'd been carrying since Bain sold me finally finding a target. Look at this place. Look at you. You all treat him like a monument to what you've lost. You've built a cage made of your own tears, and you've locked him inside it. He isn't paralyzed by a curse, Rome. He's paralyzed by your grief. You're all keeping him in that chair because you don't know who you are without a tragedy to talk about. Rome's face turned a mottled purple. You are a bartered servant. You know nothing of our king's burden. I know what it's like to be a prisoner of other people's expectations, I shot back, my voice shaking with a raw, jagged truth. I know what it's like to be used as a tool until you're too broken to function. I'm not asking for your permission to fix him. I'm telling you that your time is up. I turned and walked out, leaving the scholar sputtering in the dust. I headed straight for Vane's chamber, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had to change the frequency. If the sorrow of the palace was the fuel for his cage, I had to be the spark that burned it down. When I pushed open the iron doors, the cold hit me like a physical wall. Vane was exactly as I'd left him, a masterpiece of trapped agony. I sat on the edge of the dais, right at his feet, and I did something no one in this palace had done in 2 decades. I laughed. It was a small, dry sound at first, but it grew. I thought about Vane's face when he realized he'd sold the only woman who could actually make him a king. I thought about the absurdity of being a human bandage for a god of war. I let the absurdity of my life bleed into the room, replacing the heavy, stagnant silence with something sharp and alive. You're thinking of a tragedy, Vane, I said, leaning my head against his cold, marble-hard knee. But I think you're just waiting for someone to give you a reason to be angry again. I'm not going to cry for you. I'm not going to mourn a man who is still breathing. I reached out and grabbed his hand. I didn't hold it gently. I gripped it with the strength of a woman who had nothing left to lose. I felt that magical pulse under his skin, that frantic bird-wing flicker, and I pushed my own defiant hope into it. I imagined my anger at Bane, my refusal to be a victim, and I funneled it through my touch. Wake up, I hissed, the tears finally coming, but they weren't tears of grief. They were hot, angry drops of rebellion. Wake up and burn this place to the ground. Don't let them win. Don't let them turn you into a story they tell to feel better about their own cowardice. The air seemed to tighten. The shadows in the corners began to writhe. I didn't let go. I leaned in, pressing my forehead against his hand, my breath hitching as I felt a sudden violent surge of heat travel from his skin into mine. For 20 years he had been fed on sorrow. Tonight, I was feeding him fire. And then, in the absolute dead of the night, I felt it. It was the smallest thing, a twitch so slight it could have been a trick of the light. But beneath the palm of my hand, the king's index finger moved a fraction of an inch, scratching against the obsidian of his throne. He was fighting back. My heart leapt into my throat, a frantic, joyous thing. But as I looked up at his face, the blue of his eyes wasn't just electric anymore. They were glowing with a terrifying, predatory light that told me I hadn't just found a king. I had awakened a monster. The tray in my hands was heavy, but the weight in my chest was heavier. I had barely slept since I felt Vane's finger twitch against the stone of his throne. That tiny movement had been a lightning strike in the dark, a promise that the man inside the statue was fighting his way out. I was carrying a bowl of broth and a vial of the mineral salts I'd spent the last few hours grinding into a fine silver dust. My mind was a fever of calculations, the frequency of the pulse, the alignment of the stars, the exact moment the palace's collective grief was at its thinnest. I was halfway down the corridor when a shadow detached itself from the stone wall. Hera stood there, looking like a sharp blade wrapped in silk. She didn't belong in this part of the palace. This was the wing of the dying, and she was a woman who only breathed in places where there was power to be stolen. She looked at me, her eyes tracking the movements of my throat as I swallowed my fear. She didn't see a person, she saw a hurdle. "Still playing nurse to a corpse, Mira?" she asked, her voice a low, dangerous purr. "Vane told me you were stubborn, but I didn't realize you were delusional. You actually think you can fix him." "I don't think, Hera. I know," I said, trying to push past her. She stepped in front of me, her hand lashing out to grip my wrist. Her nails dug into my skin, a sharp, stinging reminder of the world Bane had chosen over me. "Listen to me, you little scavenger. This palace is balanced on a very specific kind of silence. The king stays in that chair, Tyne stays distracted by his grief, and people like me get to decide how the world actually turns. If you wake him up, you ruin everything, and I don't like my plans being ruined by a girl who was sold for a bag of rocks." Before I could react, she reached into the folds of her dress and pulled out a small glass stopper. With a practiced flick, she emptied a thick, colorless liquid into the broth on my tray. "Consider this a mercy," she hissed, her face inches from mine. "You'll go in there, you'll feed him his last meal, and then you'll be free to go back to the pack house and watch me wear your mate's ring. Or you can die in that room with him. I don't really care which." She shoved me back against the wall, the tray rattling dangerously, and vanished into the shadows of the hall. My heart was thundering. I looked down at the broth. It looked exactly the same, but I knew it was death. My mind went into overdrive. She thought she had won. She thought I would be too scared to do anything but obey. But Hera didn't understand the kind of rage that comes from being discarded. She didn't know that I had already died the moment Bane signed that contract. You can't threaten a woman who has already lost her world. I didn't throw the broth away. I carried it into Vane's room and locked the iron doors behind me. The king was waiting. The blue of his eyes seemed to have deepened, the electric glow behind them pulsing in time with that shimmering vibration under his jaw. I sat at his feet, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked at the poisoned bowl, and then I looked at the silver dust in my hand. The ritual required a catalyst. It required a shock to the system so violent it would force the magical cage to choose between breaking or killing the host. It required a sacrifice of pure intent. "I want you dead, Vane," I whispered, the tears finally spilling over. "They all do. They want you to stay a statue because they're terrified of what you'll do if you ever stand up." I took the silver dust and dumped it into the poisoned broth. The liquid began to hiss and smoke, a foul metallic scent filling the room. I knew what I had to do. The theory of the human bandage said the cage was fueled by grief. If I took that poison, if I stepped to the very edge of death myself, the shock of my life force flickering out would create a vacuum. It would pull the curse out of him to try and claim me. "I'm not leaving you," I said, my voice breaking. "I was sold for gold, but I'm giving myself to you for free." I lifted the bowl to my lips. The taste was bitter, like rusted iron and burnt sugar. I swallowed, and for a second, there was nothing but silence. Then the world exploded. My lungs seized. It felt like liquid fire was pouring through my veins, turning my blood into acid. I collapsed against the base of the throne, my body convulsing as the poison began to shut me down. I reached up, my fingers clawing at Vane's cold, stone-hard hand. "Now!" I screamed in my mind. "Take it! Take the life they're trying to steal!" The room began to shake. The black obsidian of a throne groaned, hairline fractures spreading through the stone like spiderwebs. The frequency under Vane's skin turned into a deafening roar, a sound that wasn't a hum anymore, but a war cry. I felt my heart stop. The darkness rushed in, cold and absolute. I was falling, my grip on Vane's hand slipping as my body went limp. And then the silence shattered. It wasn't a sound, it was a physical blow that blew the windows outward and sent the heavy curtains flying. A hand, warm, terrifyingly strong, and very much alive, clamped around my waist, hauling me up from the brink of the abyss. I gasped, my lungs burning as they forced air back into my chest. I opened my eyes, my vision blurred and swimming. I wasn't on the floor. I was being held against a chest that was rising and falling with the force of a tidal wave. I looked up. King Vane was standing. He towered over me, his skin no longer marble, but glowing with a fierce bronze heat. His blue eyes were fixed on the doors I had locked, his jaw set in a line of pure, unadulterated slaughter. He didn't look like a man who had been sitting for 20 years. He looked like a god who had just come home from the hunt. His grip on me tightened, his fingers sinking into my waist as if he were afraid I would vanish if he let go. He looked down at me, and for the first time in 20 decades, his lips moved. "You," he rasped, his voice sounding like grinding tectonic plates. "You stayed." Before I could speak, the doors to the chamber began to groan under the force of someone trying to break them down from the outside. Vane didn't flinch. He just pulled me closer, his eyes turning to the iron wood as a dark, terrifying smile touched his face. "Let them come," he whispered. "I have a debt to pay." The smell of the room had changed. For 20 years, it was a tomb that smelled of stagnant air and the slow, metallic decay of hope. Now, it was charged with the scent of a gathering storm, ozone and heated skin, and a power so thick I could feel it buzzing in the roots of my hair. Vane didn't just stand, he claimed the space around him. The way he held me against his side was a declaration. I could feel the heat of his body through my thin dress, a furnace of life that made my own blood, still fighting the remnants of Harris poison, pulse with a frantic, renewed strength. The heavy iron doors of the chamber didn't just open, they were nearly torn from their hinges as Prince Tyne and a dozen guards burst inside. They were armed, their faces tight with the expectation of finding two corpses. Instead, they found a miracle. Tyne stopped so abruptly his boots skidded on the stone, his sword lowered, the tip clattering against the floor as his mouth fell open. He looked at Vane, really looked at him, and the grief that had carved deep lines into his face for 2 decades simply vanished, replaced by a shock so profound he looked like he might faint. "Brother?" Tyne whispered, his voice cracking like dry wood. Vane didn't move. He stood like a pillar of fire, his hand still clamped around my waist, pulling me into the shelter of his strength. The electric blue of his eyes swept over the room, and I felt the guards instinctively drop to their knees. It wasn't just respect, it was the crushing weight of an alpha whose power had been compressed for 20 years, now suddenly unleashed. "The silence is over, Tyne," Vane rasped. His voice was getting stronger with every breath, losing its jagged edge and becoming a deep, resonant rumble that shook the very floorboards. He stepped forward, and I moved with him, my legs still a bit shaky. He looked at his brother, then at the guards, and finally at the shattered remnants of the bowl Hera had poisoned. He knew. He didn't need me to tell him what had happened while he was trapped in that stone-cold shell. He had heard every whisper, felt every betrayal. "You have carried the weight of this crown for too long, little brother," Vane said, his voice filling the hall. "You have been the shield while I was the statue. I will not take that from you now." He reached out his free hand and placed it on Tyne's shoulder. It was a soldier's grip, firm and grounding. The wars, the borders, the leading of the men, that is yours. You are the warrior this kingdom needs for the battles ahead. I officially name you the lead of the armies, the sword of the gray crown." Tyne let out a choked sound, half laugh and half sob, as he gripped Vane's forearm. "And you? You're leaving us again?" "No," Vane said, and he turned his gaze down to me. The intensity in his eyes was so fierce, it felt like it was stripping me bare, seeing every bruise on my soul, every scar Bane had left behind. "I remained a sovereign. I am the king who remembers the dark, but a king is nothing without the light that found him in the shadows." He let go of my waist, only to take my hand, lifting it high for everyone in the room to see. My chains were gone, broken during the shattering of the curse, but the red marks on my wrists were still there. Vane traced one with his thumb, his touch turning from steel to velvet in a heartbeat. "They sold her to me like a piece of meat." Vane's voice dropped, becoming a low, dangerous snarl that promised a reckoning. "They thought she was a human bandage to soak up my misery. They thought her mind was a burden because she saw the truths they were too cowardly to face. But while you all mourned me, while you all gave up on me, this woman fought. She walked into a tomb and refused to let the silence win. She conquered the darkness that held me captive for 20 years." I looked up at him, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm. I wasn't the broken girl Bane had discarded. I wasn't the useless weight anymore. In the reflection of Vane's eyes, I saw a queen. "Hear me," Vane roared, his power flaring out in a visible wave that made the tapestry snap against the walls. "Mira is no longer a servant of this court. She is the heart of it. From this moment on, she is my queen, my equal, my sovereign. Anyone who looks at her with anything less than the reverence they owe a goddess will answer to my shadow." The guards hammered their fists against their chests in a deafening salute. Tyne bowed low, his eyes bright with tears of joy. I leaned into Vane, my head resting against his warm, solid shoulder. I thought of Bane. I thought of the gold he was probably counting right now, the feast he was throwing for his new life. He thought he had sold me into a prison. He had no idea he had handed me the keys to the world. Vane leaned down, his lips brushing against my temple, his breath hot against my skin. "The Greymore pack thinks they are celebrating a prophet," he whispered, his voice only for me, dark and full of a cold, promised violence. "They don't know that tonight their debt is coming due. Are you ready to see your old life burn, my queen?" The music at the Greymore Festival was loud, but it sounded like a funeral dirge to me. I stood in the shadow of the great carriage, my heart thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was the place where I had been sold. These were the people who had cheered when the chains were locked around my wrists. I looked at the familiar gates, the banners snapping in the wind, and for a second, the old fear tried to claw its way back up my throat. I felt small. I felt like the girl who had been traded for gold. Then a hand found the small of my back. It was warm, steady, and carried a weight that could crush mountains. Vane stepped out beside me, his presence turning the air cold and sharp. He wasn't the statue I had bathed in the dark anymore. He was a god of war in obsidian armor, his blue eyes burning with a hunger for justice that made the very ground beneath us tremble. "Don't look at the dirt, Mira," he whispered, his voice a low vibration that settled my nerves. "Look at me. You are the only thing in this valley that matters." We walked through the gates, and the silence followed us like a spreading stain. The music died, the laughter curdled. One by one, the pack members dropped their plates and cups, their eyes widening as they saw the man they thought was a corpse walking among them. But mostly, they looked at me. I wasn't wearing the rags of a servant. I was draped in midnight silk, my hair pinned with diamonds that caught the torchlight. Bane was at the center of the square, a half-eaten leg of lamb in one hand and a goblet in the other. Hera was draped over his side, her fingers tangled in his hair. They looked bloated. They looked comfortable in their cruelty. When Bane saw me, he didn't look afraid. He looked greedy. He stood up, wiping grease from his chin with the back of his hand, a slow, ugly grin spreading across his face. "Well, look at this," Bane shouted, his voice thick with wine. "The human bandage survived, and she brought the king back from the dead. I knew you were a smart girl, Mira. I knew you'd eventually earn that gold I was paid." He stepped toward us, his chest puffed out, looking at Vane with an arrogance that made my blood boil. "I assume you're here to pay the rest of the reward, King Vane, since my mate did such a fine job of fixing you. I think it's only fair that the Greymore pack gets another chest of gold, maybe 2. Vane stopped. The air around him seemed to thicken, a dark, suffocating pressure that forced the people nearest us to gasp for breath. He looked at Bane with a disgust so pure it was beautiful. "Your mate." Vane's voice wasn't a roar, it was a jagged edge of ice. "You lost the right to use that word the moment you put a price on her life. You didn't sell me a servant, Bane. You sold me your sovereign." Vane's grin faltered. "What are you talking about? She's a Greymore female. She belongs to no one but herself," Vane interrupted, his power flaring out in a visible wave of blue light that sent the tables crashing back. "And as of this moment, she is the queen of the Grey Crown. That means she owns your land, she owns your home, and she owns your very breath." I stepped forward then, moving out from behind Vane's shadow. I looked Bane in the eye, the man I had once loved, the man who had shattered my soul for a few bags of coin. He looked small now, pathetic. I could see the sweat beading on his forehead, the way his hands started to shake. "You told me I was finally worth something when you sold me, Bane," I said, my voice steady and cold. "I'm worth more than you could ever imagine." Vane turned to his guards, his face a mask of iron. "Strip him of his title, take his crest. He is no longer an alpha. Since he likes to trade in human lives, he will spend the rest of his days learning what it means to be a tool. He will be sent to the palace kitchens. He will scrub the floors I sat on for 20 years. He will eat the scraps, and he will sleep in the dirt." Hera tried to shrink away, but the guards were already there, seizing Bane by the arms. He screamed, he kicked, he begged for mercy, but the pack stayed silent. They watched as their leader was dragged through the mud, his fine clothes torn, his pride ground into the dust. I watched him go, and I expected to feel a rush of hatred, but all I felt was a deep, quiet peace. The hole in my chest wasn't there anymore. It had been filled with a fire that would never go out. I turned to Vane, and the hardness in his face melted the moment he looked at me. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of my jaw with a tenderness that made my breath hitch. "The debt is paid, Mira. You are home." I looked at the people of Greymore, at the sunset painting the hills in gold, and I realized I wasn't a sacrifice anymore. I was the storm. I took Vane's hand, lacing my fingers through his, and walked away from the ashes of my old life without looking back. If Mira's rise from the dirt to the throne moved you, let me know in the comments. Would you have shown Bane mercy, or would you have burned it all down? If you want more stories where the underdog becomes the nightmare, subscribe and stay with me. The king has awakened, but our story is just beginning.